Half a ton of steel crashed directly onto his head, shattering 3 cervical vertebrae and turning soul legend Curtis Mayfield into a paralyzed body in exactly 1 second. This was the horrific tragedy of the 13th of August, 1990, in Brooklyn, when a stage lighting rig became a lethal guillotine, crushing the icon's body right before the eyes of thousands of screaming fans. At 48, at the absolute peak of his career, he was handed the ultimate life sentence: total paralysis from the neck down, spending the final 3,425 days of his life imprisoned within his own motionless flesh. A genius who once used his soaring falsetto to move the world now found even breathing to be a survival battle, marking the start of the most tragic and haunting final chapter in music history. Curtis Mayfield was not merely a soul singer. He was the chief architect of the Black Soul and the possessor of records that fundamentally shifted the global musical landscape. He stands as the most defiant artist of his era, daring to trade hollow love songs for a sonic bayonet aimed at the heart of systemic injustice. His anthem, "People Get Ready," is etched into history as one of the greatest songs of all time, serving as the spiritual backbone for the civil rights movement. Perhaps his most revolutionary feat was achieving absolute creative sovereignty in 1970 by founding Curtis Records. In an age where black artists were systematically bled dry by predatory contracts, Mayfield became his own master, controlling every master recording and every cent of his destiny. The pinnacle of his cultural dominance remains the Superfly soundtrack, a masterpiece that raked in an unprecedented $5 million in mere months. While others glamorized the street life, Mayfield's sharp, observational lyrics acted as a brutal mirror to the drug-infested reality of the American ghetto. With a fragile yet piercing falsetto and a unique open-tuning guitar style, he wielded a soft power where melodic gentleness could dismantle the most violent social prejudices. He was, and remains, the most influential street philosopher to ever touch a microphone. The story of the man who would eventually move the world began in the cramped, soul-crushing poverty of Chicago's Cabrini Green housing projects, a place where hope was often as scarce as a warm meal. Born in 1942, Curtis Lee Mayfield entered a world of sharp contrasts, where the brutal cold of the Midwestern winters matched the icy grip of systemic segregation. But within the walls of his home, a different kind of fire was being stoked by the 2 most influential women in his life, his mother, Marion, and his grandmother, Annie Bell. His grandmother was a traveling soul spiritualist minister, and it was under her wing at the Northern Brotherhood Gospel Church that young Curtis first discovered the transformative power of sound. While other children were playing in the debris-strewn streets, Curtis was absorbing the soaring, ethereal harmonies of the gospel choir, learning that music wasn't just entertainment, it was a lifeline, a divine conversation, and a vessel for a people's collective pain and aspiration. This sacred foundation gave him a moral compass that would never waver, even when he eventually traded the pulpit for the world stage. By the age of 7, the boy with the quiet eyes and the observant mind found his true voice through an old, battered guitar that seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. Because he had no formal training, Curtis didn't play like anyone else. He tuned his guitar to the black keys of the piano, creating an open F-sharp tuning that produced a lush, shimmering resonance that felt like a warm breeze cutting through a Chicago blizzard. This wasn't just a technical quirk, it was the birth of a signature sound, a hauntingly beautiful sonic signature that would become the heartbeat of his future masterpieces. He spent countless hours in the solitude of his room, his fingers bleeding onto the strings as he translated the rhythms of the street and the echoes of the church into a language only he understood. He wasn't just learning to play an instrument, he was building a sanctuary, a private world where the poverty of his surroundings couldn't touch him. The street corners of Chicago in the late 1950s were the ultimate testing ground for young talent, and it was here that fate brought Curtis together with Jerry Butler, a man whose baritone was as smooth as silk. Together, they formed the Roosters, which would soon evolve into the legendary group, the Impressions. At only 14 years old, Curtis was already demonstrating a maturity that far outpaced his peers, acting not just as a singer, but as a budding songwriter with an uncanny ability to distill complex emotions into simple, devastating melodies. When Jerry Butler eventually left the group for a solo career, the weight of the Impressions fell squarely onto the teenage shoulders of Curtis Mayfield. Most would have buckled under the pressure, but Curtis saw it as his initiation. He took the lead, and in doing so, he began to refine the Chicago soul sound, a sophisticated blend of gospel-infused vocals and horn-heavy arrangements that felt both elegant and earthy. This period was the crucible where the Mayfield philosophy was forged. He watched his mother struggle to keep the family afloat, saw his friends swallowed by the grinding machinery of the ghetto, and felt the stinging slap of racial prejudice every time he stepped outside his neighborhood. Instead of reacting with blind rage, he channeled those experiences into a profound sense of empathy. He began to realize that the songs he heard on the radio were missing something. They were missing the truth of his people's lives. He didn't want to just write about holding hands under the moonlight. He wanted to write about the strength it took to keep walking when your shoes had holes in them and the world told you that you didn't matter. This realization was the spark that ignited his transition from a mere pop singer to a social prophet. The foundation was now set. A boy raised on gospel, armed with a uniquely tuned guitar, and driven by a burning desire to give a voice to the voiceless. He was no longer just Curtis from Cabrini Green. He was a revolutionary in the making, standing on the precipice of a career that would redefine the soul of America. As the 1960s began to bleed into a turbulent decade, Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions found themselves at the center of a musical tornado, but Curtis was no longer content just spinning with the wind. The private path he was entering was not one of isolation, but of profound moral isolationism from the industry's shallow demands. He had tasted the sweet, uncomplicated nectar of a top 10 hit with 1,958's For Your Precious Love. But the world outside his Chicago window was changing too fast, too violently, to keep singing about mere holding hands. He looked at the growing civil rights movement and saw a people in desperate need of a soundtrack, a battle cry that didn't just advocate anger, but dignity. The traditional pop machine, however, demanded safe music, terrified that any hint of racial pride would alienate white audiences and dry up the river of revenue. This was the defining crossroads for Curtis. He could take the easy, paved road to comfortable stardom by sanitizing his sound, or he could forge a new, dangerous trail that led directly into the heart of the American storm. The first profound manifestation of this new path came in 1964, with the shattering simplicity of Keep On Pushing. When the track was released, it was immediately embraced as an underground anthem for protesters facing police batons and water cannons. But it was the following year's People Get Ready that cemented his status as a lyrical prophet. The song, built on a gentle gospel shuffle and anchored by a tender horn arrangement, was less a pop single and more a secular psalm. When Curtis sang People Get Ready, There's a Train A-Comin', he wasn't singing about Amtrak, he was singing about the unstoppable train of justice, and his words possessed a spiritual authority that transcended musical genres. The track became a unifier, hummed by activists in the streets of Selma, and played over and over on black radio stations, providing a sense of divine purpose to a struggle that often felt hopeless. Yet Curtis was subtle. His genius was cloaking these powerful, revolutionary messages in beautiful, accessible soul melodies. He realized he could smuggle truth into the hearts of millions if he just wrapped it in a sweet, undeniable hook. However, this subtlety also brought intense scrutiny. As the struggle intensified, younger, more militant black activists began to find the Impressions' messages of patient perseverance too passive. At the same time, the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, began to monitor Mayfield, viewing any black artist with a social conscience as a potential threat to national stability. But the most direct conflict Curtis faced was with the record labels themselves. They constantly pressured him to stay in his lane and produce more conventional, easily marketable R&B. They didn't want a philosopher, they wanted a product. Curtis's refusal to dilute his message led him to a realization that would alter the history of black music. True artistic freedom required economic freedom. He saw how the industry was designed to chew up black talent, leaving them broke and broken once their hits ran dry. He was watching his own revenue being drained by white-owned corporations that had no stake in the community he was singing about. This brings us to 1970, the point of no return. Curtis made the single most audacious move of his career. He walked away from the security of major label deals and, with his manager, Eddie Thomas, founded Curtis Records, becoming one of the first major black artists to own his own masters, publishing, and record company. By setting up his office in a modest brick building in Chicago's South Side, he sent a shockwave through the industry. He was no longer just a private path wanderer. He was a private architect, building an asylum where he, and other emerging talent, could speak without being muzzled by corporate fear. His first release under his own flag, 1970's, Curtis, was a masterclass in this newfound autonomy. He abandoned the group format, fully embracing his solo voice and the Chicago soul sound he had spent a decade perfecting, a mixture of soaring strings, punchy brass, and an intricate, rhythmic guitar work that felt utterly modern. The Curtis album didn't just introduce a new artist, it introduced a new paradigm, proving that a black man could control both the message and the means of distribution. By 1971, Curtis Mayfield was no longer just an emerging solo artist. He was a rising sun in the musical firmament, but the spotlight was about to become blinding. His debut solo album, Curtis, had already proven his artistic and commercial viability, showcasing a master storyteller who could blend lush orchestration with street-level grit. But it was his next move that would not only define his career, but also redefine an entire film genre and the very sound of the 1970s. The offer came from an unexpected source, Sig Shore, a film producer who wanted Curtis to score a new blaxploitation movie called Superfly. The genre, characterized by its focus on urban crime, flashy anti-heroes, and raw violence, was exploding in popularity, but its soundtracks were often little more than functional background music. Curtis, however, saw a different opportunity. He didn't want to just write music for the movie. He wanted to create a musical counterpart, a narrative that could exist independently of the celluloid and, more importantly, offer a counter-narrative to the film's perceived glorification of the drug trade. This was his true peak, the moment he used the ultimate pop culture platform to deliver his most devastating social critique. When the Superfly soundtrack was released in 1972, it was an instant, thunderous cultural phenomenon. The music was unlike anything ever heard before. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered sonic tapestry that blended Latin-infused percussion, punchy brass arrangements, a swirling, ethereal string section, and that now iconic, wah-wah-soaked guitar work. Above it all floated Curtis's falsetto, a delicate instrument that somehow possessed the power to cuttingly dissect the very lifestyle the film appeared to celebrate. Songs like Pusherman weren't just descriptions, they were dark, detailed portraits of the predatory forces devouring the inner city, while the title track, Superfly, offered a haunting, cautionary tale about the high cost of street glory. The album didn't just sell, it became an urban gospel, a sonic map of a community in crisis. It raked in an astonishing $5 million in its first few months, outgrossing the film itself and turning Curtis Mayfield into a global superstar. He was no longer just a soul singer. He was a cultural philosopher, a man who could command an audience of millions with a whisper and a unique guitar lick. The spotlight wasn't just on him, it was illuminating the very issues he had dedicated his life to exposing. This global spotlight brought new levels of demand and pressure. Curtis found himself thrust onto international stages, performing to massive crowds who might not have fully grasped the nuances of his lyrical social commentary, but were utterly captivated by the Superfly sound. He was a paradox, a soft-spoken, deeply spiritual family man from Chicago, now an international icon for a cool, urban aesthetic he was actually critiquing. He was constantly traveling, performing, and producing not just for himself, but for the entire stable of artists on his Curtis Records label. He was now an industry titan, responsible for the careers of Leroy Hudson, the Five Stairsteps, and even producing hits for Aretha Franklin. The sheer scale of his operation was staggering, a testament to his vision of black economic and artistic self-determination. Yet, amidst the whirlwind of success, Curtis remained remarkably grounded. He viewed the Superfly phenomenon not as an endpoint, but as another tool, a more powerful megaphone to amplify his message. He continued to produce albums like 1973's Back to the World, which explored the difficult reintegration of black Vietnam veterans, proving that his social conscience was far from satiated by commercial success. The peak, however, is a precarious place to stand. While Superfly cemented his legacy, it also, in many ways, stereotyped him. The industry, ever eager to replicate a formula, constantly pressured him to deliver more Superfly. The unique falsetto and wah-wah guitar became his signature, a double-edged sword that both delighted his fans and limited his perceived artistic range. The spotlight was intensely focused, but it was also, perhaps preventing the broader public from seeing the full depth and versatility of his musical genius. He was a master of gospel, a sophisticated jazz-inflected composer, and a pioneering funk producer. But the world, at least for a moment, saw only the king of blaxploitation soul. This was the internal contradiction of his peak. He had achieved the ultimate artistic freedom by building his own kingdom, only to find himself, in a sense, imprisoned by his greatest commercial triumph. He was a prophet whose message was sometimes lost in the beautiful noise of his own creation. The spotlight was a beacon, but it was also a filter, shaping the world's perception of a complex man who was always, at his core, a private seeker of truth. The peak was high, but the ground was already beginning to shift. The mid-1970s brought a cold, creeping shadow that no one, not even a visionary like Curtis Mayfield, could have fully anticipated. The musical landscape of America was beginning to fracture, shifting away from the socially conscious, grit-infused soul that Curtis had pioneered. A new, glittery monster was rising from the underground clubs of New York and Los Angeles, disco. It was a genre built on escapism, four-on-the-floor beats, and a relentless pursuit of hedonism, the exact opposite of everything Curtis stood for. Suddenly, the street philosopher found himself out of step with a generation that no longer wanted to hear about the struggle in the ghetto or the plight of Vietnam veterans. They wanted to dance their troubles away under a spinning mirror ball. For a man who had built his entire career on substance and truth, this shift was a profound psychological blow. He watched as the radio stations that once played "People Get Ready" on loop began to prioritize synthesized beats and shallow lyrics, leaving his sophisticated arrangements and moral messaging gathering dust in the bargain bins. This cultural shift triggered a slow-motion collapse of the independent empire he had worked so hard to build. Curtis Records, once a beacon of black economic power, began to bleed money as distribution deals soured and record sales plummeted. Being an independent owner meant that, when the hits stopped coming, there was no corporate safety net to catch him. Curtis was forced to make grueling decisions, trimming his staff and eventually shuttering the iconic Chicago office that had been the heartbeat of his creative life. The pressure was immense. He wasn't just an artist. He was responsible for the livelihoods of dozens of people, and the weight of that responsibility began to etch lines of exhaustion onto his face. By the early 1980s, the man who had out-earned major film studios was struggling to keep his label afloat, eventually being forced to sign a distribution deal with a major label, the very thing he had fought so hard to escape a decade earlier. It was a bitter irony that the industry he tried to bypass was now his only means of survival. Amidst this professional decline, a sense of creative isolation began to set in. Curtis felt like a man out of time, a prophet whose congregation had moved on to a different, flashier religion. He continued to release music, but the spark seemed muffled by the demands of a changing market. He tried to adapt, incorporating more electronic elements into his sound, but it often felt forced, a pale imitation of the organic Chicago soul that flowed so naturally from his fingertips. The dark side wasn't just about money, it was about the erosion of his identity as a cultural leader. He was seeing the communities he sang about being ravaged by the crack cocaine epidemic, the very nightmare he had warned about in Superfly, yet his voice seemed to lack the reach it once had. This internal collapse was quiet, a steady accumulation of disappointments that would have broken a lesser man, but Curtis maintained a stoic, dignified exterior, refusing to let the world see the cracks in his armor. Then came the night that would turn a slow decline into a permanent, bone-shattering catastrophe. The 13th of August, 1990. Brooklyn, New York. Curtis was scheduled to perform at an outdoor festival at Wingate Field. Despite the professional hurdles of the previous decade, he was still a beloved figure, and thousands had gathered to hear the legendary falsetto under the summer stars. But the weather had other plans. As Curtis was being introduced, a sudden, violent windstorm whipped across the field, turning the stage into a death trap. In a horrific sequence that felt like slow motion, the massive overhead lighting rig, weighing nearly half a ton, began to sway violently before shearing off its moorings. It didn't just fall, it hunted him. The heavy steel truss crashed directly onto Curtis, pinning him to the stage in a twisted heap of metal and glass. The sound was a sickening crunch that silenced the music forever. The aftermath was a scene of pure chaos. Fans screamed in terror as stagehands scrambled to lift the crushing weight off their idol. When they finally reached him, the sight was devastating. Curtis was conscious, his eyes wide with a terrifying clarity, but he couldn't feel anything below his neck. At the age of 48, at a moment when he was beginning to find a new creative footing, his body had been effectively severed from his mind. The medical report was a cold, clinical death sentence. The third, fourth, and fifth cervical vertebrae had been pulverized. He was a quadriplegic. The man who lived to move people, who played the guitar with a grace that seemed supernatural, was now a prisoner within a motionless shell of flesh. The vibrant, rhythmic world of Curtis Mayfield had been reduced to the four walls of a hospital room and the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. The following months were a descent into a private purgatory. The internal collapse was now literal and total. Curtis had to endure the soul-crushing realization that he would never again hold a guitar, never again walk across a stage, and never again be able to perform the simple, everyday tasks of a father and husband. The medical bills were astronomical, further draining his already depleted finances. He went from being a global icon of strength and independence to being entirely dependent on others for his most basic needs. For a man who had prided himself on moving on up and keeping on pushing, this was the ultimate test of his philosophy. The darkness wasn't just the lack of light, it was the silence of his own limbs. He spent long, agonizing hours in physical therapy, hoping for a miracle that the doctors knew wasn't coming. His voice, once a soaring instrument of divine beauty, was now thin and raspy, hampered by his inability to use his diaphragm to breathe. This was the absolute nadir of his existence, a genius silenced, a leader immobilized, and a legend seemingly erased by a freak accident of nature. The world watched in somber silence as the news of his condition spread, mourning a man who was still alive but trapped in a living death. The dark side had claimed his body, and for a long time it seemed it would claim his spirit too. For 6 long, agonizing years after that catastrophic night in Brooklyn, the world heard nothing but a deafening silence from the house of Curtis Mayfield. The street prophet had vanished into a private purgatory of clinical white walls and the rhythmic hiss of medical machinery. The internal collapse was so total that many believed his creative soul had been crushed along with his spine. He was a man who had built his life on movement, the movement of a melody, the movement of a social cause, the physical movement of his fingers across a fretboard. Now, he was a prisoner of his own flesh, unable to even tilt his head to see the gold records on his wall. But in 1996, something shifted. The turning point didn't come as a sudden medical miracle. It came as a quiet, stubborn flickering of the spirit. Curtis realized that while the half-ton of steel had stolen his limbs, it had failed to touch his mind or his message. He decided he was going to record one last album, even if it killed him to do it. This was not a standard recording session. It was a feat of sheer, superhuman will that redefined what it meant to be an artist. Because his lungs were partially paralyzed, Curtis no longer had the breath control to sustain those iconic soaring falsetto notes. He couldn't sit up in a chair to reach the microphone. So, the studio was brought to his bedside. He recorded his final masterpiece, New World Order, while lying flat on his back, staring at the ceiling. Every line, every phrase was a battle for oxygen. He would sing one line, stop to labor for breath, and then sing the next. It was a painstaking, microscopic process of assembly, a mosaic of soul created by a man who was literally fighting for every gasp of air. His voice had changed. It was thinner, more fragile, haunted by a rasp that wasn't there before. But what it lost in power, it gained in a devastating ancient wisdom. When he sang, you didn't just hear music, you heard the vibration of a soul that had been through the fire and refused to turn to ash. The rebirth was different this time. It wasn't about the flashy suits or the Superfly swagger. It was a stripped-back, raw transmission from the edge of existence. The lyrics in New World Order showed that despite his physical state, his social conscience was sharper than ever. He was still looking out the window at a world in chaos, still preaching unity and resilience, but now his words carried the weight of a man who knew exactly how much pushing on actually cost. The industry was stunned. Artists who had sampled his music for years, the new kings of hip-hop and R&B, watched in awe as their mentor proved that music was not a product of the body, but an emission of the spirit. He wasn't just reborn as a celebrity, he was reborn as a symbol of ultimate defiance. He proved that as long as there is a thought and a way to whisper it, a revolutionary cannot be silenced. This final act of creation was his greatest move on up, a spiritual ascent that transcended the gravity of his broken body and reminded the world that Curtis Mayfield was, and always would be, invincible. The physical flame of Curtis Mayfield finally flickered out on the 26th of December 1999 in Roswell, Georgia. After nearly a decade of battling the agonizing complications of quadriplegia and the onset of type 2 diabetes, which had already claimed his right leg, the gentle genius surrendered his breath to the heavens. He was 57 years old. But as the world mourned the man, they realized that the legacy he left behind was not a cold monument of the past, but a living, breathing blueprint for the future of black music. Curtis didn't just leave behind a catalog of hits. He left behind a DNA strand that would weave itself into the very fabric of hip-hop, neo-soul, and modern R&B. He was the spiritual godfather to a new generation of street philosophers who saw in his struggle the ultimate example of artistic integrity and economic independence. The true scale of his life after is measured in the echoes of his sound that continue to reverberate through the charts decades later. When Kanye West sampled Move On Up for Touch the Sky, or when Jay-Z and Kendrick Lamar drew inspiration from the gritty social realism of Superfly, they weren't just using catchy loops. They were tapping into a well of ancestral wisdom. Curtis taught them that a song could be a weapon, a shield, and a sanctuary all at once. His induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once with the Impressions and once as a solo artist, was a formal recognition of his dual impact as a group leader and a visionary individual. But his real Hall of Fame exists in the streets of Chicago, in the protest lines of modern social justice movements, and in the bedrooms of every young guitarist who tunes their strings to that unique open F sharp to find a sound that feels like home. Moreover, his legacy is one of the independent architect. By founding Curtis Records, Curtis Mayfield proved to every artist of color that they didn't have to be a sharecropper in someone else's musical field. He showed that you could own your masters, control your image, and still reach the mountaintop of global success. He was the prototype for the modern mogul, blending high-level business acumen with deep, uncompromised spirituality. Today, whenever an artist fights for their masters or uses their platform to speak truth to power, the ghost of Curtis Mayfield is in the room, nodding in approval. He remains the gold standard for how to be a superstar without losing your soul. His body was broken, but his influence is indestructible, a soaring falsetto light that continues to guide anyone brave enough to keep on pushing against the darkness of the world. The music of Curtis Mayfield ends not with a crash, but with a lingering golden vibration. As we reflect on the 57 years of this gentle genius, we are forced to confront a haunting paradox. How could a man who sang so delicately about heaven and hope be crushed so violently by the earth? The aftermath of his life isn't found in a cemetery in Chicago, but in the quiet dignity of every artist who refuses to sell their soul for a charted hit. Curtis Mayfield was the bridge between the sacred and the street, a man who proved that you could be a revolutionary without ever raising your voice above a whisper. Today, the 3,425 days he spent in a motionless body are not remembered as a period of defeat, but as the ultimate testament to the human spirit. He showed us that while gravity can break the bone, it has no power over the melody. When you hear that shimmering guitar or that soaring falsetto today, you aren't just hearing a relic of the 70s, you are hearing a living instruction manual on how to endure. The aftermath of Curtis Mayfield is a world that is slightly more conscious, a bit more soulful, and infinitely more resilient. He moved on up, not just to the top of the charts, but to a permanent place in the collective conscience of humanity. The lights may have fallen in Brooklyn, but the sun he set in motion will never stop rising. Keep on pushing, because as Curtis taught us, the train is always coming, and the music never truly stops.